The air above the vast, unforgiving plains of the Serengeti had been still for days, heavy with a heat that promised relief but offered none. It was the deceptive calm that precedes nature's most violent outbursts. For the pride of lions near the acacia thicket, life moved at its timeless, weary pace. And for one tiny member, a male cub barely 6 weeks old named Quito, the world was already a giant, overwhelming place. Quito was small, even for his age, a little ball of spotted fur and clumsy paws, his roars nothing more than tiny, squeaky declarations of hunger and discomfort. He was always close to his mother, a constant, comforting presence amidst the colossal shadows and dangerous sounds of the wild. The storm did not announce itself with the usual measured warnings. It arrived like a catastrophic event, a wall of wind and water driven by an unseen fury. One moment, Quito was nestled safely against his mother's flank. The next, the world exploded into chaos. The sky tore open, releasing a deluge that transformed the dry earth into a slick, treacherous bog in minutes. Lightning cracked the heavens, blinding white flashes followed by deafening rolls of thunder that shook the ground and sent the entire pride into a panicked scatter. In the sheer primal confusion, Quito was lost. A sudden gust of wind, strong enough to uproot small shrubs, knocked the cub tumbling into a dense mat of wet grass. He scrambled, terrified, his tiny paws slipping on the mud, his scent markers instantly washed away by the torrent. He cried out, a thin, desolate mule lost instantly in the roar of the downpour. He moved blindly, propelled by instinctual fear, his only desire to find the warmth and familiar smell of his mother. But the lionesses, equally disoriented by the storm's ferocity, could only concentrate on finding the nearest, immediate shelter and protecting the remaining cubs they could gather. Quito's small cry was a whisper in a hurricane, unheard, unacknowledged. As the hours dragged on, the rain showed no sign of relenting. Quito huddled beneath a low-hanging thorn bush, shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold that seeped into his bones, but from a profound existential terror. The water rose, surrounding his tiny refuge, turning the world into a vast, cold, watery grave. He was alone. The familiar smells of the pride, the musk, the blood, the comfort, were replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of rain and the overpowering smell of wet earth. His energy waned, the initial panic subsided into a cold, dull ache of hopelessness. He was a creature designed for warmth and collective strength, now exposed to the raw, indifferent malice of the wild. He whimpered once more, a soft, resigned sound, and closed his eyes, his small body barely moving, preparing to surrender to the cold embrace of the elements. Hundreds of miles away, fighting the same impossible weather, was Daniel Evans. Daniel was a man whose life had been dedicated to the silent observation of this very wilderness. A seasoned wildlife photographer and documentary filmmaker, he understood the savannah better than most people understood their own backyards. His vehicle, a rugged, battered 4x4 named the Wanderer, was more home to him than any brick-and-mortar structure. He was attempting to navigate a treacherous, barely there track, heading toward a small research outpost to deliver emergency supplies, a task that now seemed deeply foolish given the conditions. "This is not a storm, it's an ocean," Daniel muttered to himself, peering through the wipers that struggled against the relentless sheets of rain. The engine strained, the tires fighting for purchase in the thick, glue-like mud. He knew the dangers. Flash floods could turn dry riverbeds into lethal traps in minutes. Animals, panicked and driven from their safe havens, often wandered into peril. Every sense Daniel possessed was on high alert, sharpened by years of observing and surviving the African wild. He was focused on the terrain immediately ahead, the visibility barely 30 feet, when a flicker of movement, something impossibly small and dark, caught the corner of his eye. It was an anomaly, a tiny disruption in the monotonous grey-brown landscape of mud and water. Daniel immediately slammed on the brakes, the powerful vehicle hydroplaning slightly before shuddering to a halt. His heart pounded, a familiar deep thrumming that always accompanied a life-or-death moment in the bush. He cut the engine, the sudden silence immediately filled by the violent drumming of rain on the metal roof. Daniel squinted, leaning forward, trying to penetrate the gloom. It took a moment, and then his professional eye, trained to spot the subtle camouflage of the savannah, registered the shape. It was a creature, and it was still. A dark, sodden lump beneath the shelter of a scrubby bush, dangerously close to a pooling runoff stream. He grabbed his heavy waterproof coat and without a second thought swung open the door, stepping out into the cold, soaking world. The water immediately breached the top of his boots, a shock of icy coldness that galvanized him. He moved quickly, fighting the wind, his gaze fixed on the small form. As he got closer, his breath hitched. It wasn't a hare or a small buck. It was a lion cub, a baby, barely bigger than a domestic cat, utterly motionless and seemingly lifeless. Daniel knelt in the mud beside the cub, carefully pushing aside the wet branches. The cub, Quito, was unresponsive. His fur was matted and heavy with water, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was hypothermic, critically weak, and barely clinging to life. Daniel gently scooped the tiny body into his arms. The cub was astonishingly light, the bones seeming fragile beneath the wet, cold skin. There was no sign of the mother or the pride. They were gone, driven away by the storm, or perhaps lost themselves. Daniel knew, with the stark, brutal clarity the wild often enforces, that if he left this cub, Quito would not survive the hour. The decision was not complex, but the implications were monumental. To interfere with nature was against every principle of his work. To take a wild animal, especially a lion, was fraught with legal, ethical, and immediate physical danger. But this wasn't an interference. It was an emergency medical intervention. This cub was effectively already dead unless drastic action was taken. Daniel held the cold, limp body close to his chest, transferring what little body heat he could through his heavy coat. Back inside the relative shelter of the Wanderer, Daniel worked with frantic precision. He started the engine for heat, wrapped Quito carefully in a thermal blanket he always kept for emergencies, and placed the cub gently on the passenger seat, tucked against the console. Quito did not move. Only a faint, shallow rise and fall of his tiny ribcage, confirming he was still alive. Daniel rummaged through his medical kit, extracting a sterile syringe and a small vial of electrolyte solution, intended for rehydrating human subjects in the heat, but now a desperate measure for the cub. He administered a small amount of the solution carefully, drop by drop, coaxing the cub to swallow. Quito's eyes remained closed, his mouth moving only reflexively. Daniel continued to rub the cub's fur, working gently to restore circulation and dry the waterlogged coat. The smell of wet lion, sharp and wild, began to permeate the warm air of the cab, an intoxicating yet terrifying aroma. This was a wild animal, a predator, and its life was now entirely dependent on him, a temporary god in a metal box. As Daniel sat, waiting for any flicker of response, the enormity of his commitment sank in. He had saved the cub from drowning and freezing, but the struggle for life had just begun. He looked at the frail, vulnerable creature, the symbol of Africa's might, reduced to this shivering, helpless bundle. The fate of this magnificent beast, destined to be king of the plains, now hung by a thread, a single waterlogged thread. The journey ahead was still long and dangerous. He needed to drive, but he couldn't take his eyes off the cub. He had committed to this rescue, and now he was driving into the heart of the wild with a very big secret beside him. A secret that would change his life forever, regardless of the cub's fate. He pulled out his satellite phone, knowing he needed to call someone, anyone, but who? A conservation official? That would mean the immediate confiscation of Quito, likely to a crowded, stressful rehabilitation center, or worse, euthanasia, if they deemed him too far gone. He postponed the call. Not yet. Not until Quito showed some sign of fight. Daniel shifted the vehicle into low gear, creeping forward through the thick mud. Every revolution of the tires a calculated risk. The rain was finally beginning to subside, turning from a violent downpour into a heavy drizzle. A sliver of pale, ominous light appeared on the eastern horizon, revealing the damage: snapped tree limbs, vast pools of water, and the scattered tracks of fleeing animals. The whole world felt bruised as the sun began its sluggish ascent, painting the ravaged sky in bruised purples and exhausted grays. Quito finally stirred. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, followed by a soft, dry cough. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He immediately stopped the vehicle, reaching out to stroke the cub's back gently. Quito lifted his head an inch, his eyes, the deep, luminous gold of a sunrise, opening briefly, looking right into Daniel's. There was no aggression, only confusion and the desperate clinging to the warmth and safety he felt. It was a silent exchange, a bond forged in the crucible of chaos. The cub mewled again, a stronger sound this time, and then with an effort that seemed immense, he tried to lick Daniel's hand. Daniel smiled, a tired, relieved, and deeply determined smile. "That's it, little guy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're a fighter, aren't you, Quito? We'll call you Quito. And as we continue Daniel and Quito's incredible, heart-stopping journey through the unforgiving savannah, remember that these stories, the ones of fierce love and miraculous survival, are only possible because of your support. If you are captivated by the raw beauty and emotional power of the animal world, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your like helps share Quito's story with millions who need a reminder of the kindness and strength that exists, even in the wildest places. Thank you for joining us on this incredible adventure. Daniel realized he needed proper shelter, not just for the cub's recovery, but for his own safety and for the serious planning required. The research outpost was too far, and the mud made travel agonizingly slow. He remembered an old, unused ranger station, a solid, concrete structure built decades ago, long since abandoned, about an hour off his current path. It was a perfect sanctuary, isolated and defensible. The mud, however, was proving almost impassable. He spent the next few hours fighting the vehicle, using sand ladders and sheer force of will to keep moving. The emotional toll was as heavy as the physical effort. Every near-stuck moment brought a fresh wave of panic, not for himself, but for the fragile life nestled on the seat beside him. Quito, thankfully, remained wrapped and quiet, the warmth doing its slow, life-saving work. Finally, the ranger station appeared through the mist, a stark, imposing structure of weathered grey concrete, surrounded by a dilapidated chain-link fence. It looked forgotten, a ghost in the vast landscape, but it was solid. Daniel drove the vehicle right up to the small metal garage door, which miraculously was only secured by a rusted chain. He used the large bolt cutters he always carried, and the chain snapped with a loud metallic crack. It was a sound that felt like a permanent breach of a boundary, both physical and ethical. He was now fully committed to this rescue, crossing a line into a deep, unknown territory. Inside the garage, the air was still and dusty, smelling of old concrete and dry earth, a blessed respite from the wet outside. Daniel quickly cleared a small, relatively clean area. He brought Quito, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, inside. The cub was showing much more color now, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of Daniel's movements. Daniel prepared a temporary bed using a thick canvas ground cover and more blankets. The next immediate priority was nourishment. Quito was dehydrated and starving. Daniel knew he couldn't give him solid food, nor would the cub's digestive system tolerate milk from a cow. He had specialized high-calorie liquid nutritional supplements for his own long trips, meant for emergency human consumption. And he carefully mixed a tiny amount with bottled water, warming it gently in a small pot over his portable gas stove. He didn't have a proper feeding bottle for a cub, so he improvised, using the same small syringe from before, now fitted with a soft, pliable rubber tip. It was an agonizing process. Quito initially resisted, his instinct telling him this foreign substance was dangerous. Daniel spoke to him softly, his voice low and reassuring, using the name Quito over and over again. After several minutes of patient, gentle coaxing, the cub finally latched onto the rubber tip. The sensation of the warm liquid entering his system was clearly a profound relief. He began to suckle with a desperate, ancient energy. It was a slow feed, maybe only a few ounces, but it was enough. The act of eating, the restoration of basic biological function, was the first true step back from the brink of death. As Quito drifted into a deeper, less agitated sleep, Daniel sat back on his heels, watching the cub's steady, even breathing. The magnitude of what he had done and what he still had to do settled over him like the heavy weight of the storm-soaked sky. Quito needed specialized care, veterinary attention, and most importantly, a long-term plan. He couldn't raise a wild lion, no matter how deep the emotional bond he already felt. This was a king, not a pet. The immediate fear was over, replaced by a complex, terrifying set of obligations. He looked around the forgotten station. The concrete walls were thick, offering protection. He secured the doors and windows as best he could, setting up a perimeter of safety. The storm had broken, but the emotional chaos within Daniel was just beginning. He was now the sole guardian of a baby lion, miles from civilization, with the entire weight of the conservation world potentially bearing down on him. The immediate needs of Quito were met, but the questions remained. How long could he keep him here? Where could he take him? And what would happen if the cub's mother, having weathered the storm, eventually came looking for her lost jewel? Daniel realized he hadn't slept in over 40 hours, the combined stress of the storm, the drive, and the high-stakes rescue having burned through his reserves. He decided to allow himself a brief 2-hour rest, setting a loud mechanical alarm clock, the sort of noisy, old-school device that couldn't be ignored, to wake him. Even as he lay down on a makeshift pallet, wrapped in a blanket, his body ached with fatigue, his mind was racing. He kept one hand resting near Quito's bed, needing the physical confirmation that the tiny life was still there, warm, breathing, and now, miraculously, safe. The soft, wild scent of the cub was the last thing he smelled before exhaustion finally pulled him under. Part 1 of Quito's incredible story had reached its dramatic conclusion, but the rescue was far from over. The mechanical screech of the old alarm clock ripped Daniel from his exhausted sleep, a brutal intrusion into the quiet solitude of the abandoned ranger station. It had only been 2 hours, but the brief, deep rest had taken the sharp edge off his fatigue. He sat up instantly, his first conscious thought for the cub. Quito was still sleeping, a small, dark form nestled deep within the makeshift blankets, his breathing a steady, reassuring puff of air. Daniel felt a powerful surge of relief, followed by the heavy weight of responsibility. The cub had survived the night. Now the real challenge began, keeping a wild lion alive, safely and secretly. Daniel moved with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to isolation and the demands of the bush. His first priority was Quito's warmth and hygiene. He carefully checked the cub's temperature by feeling his ears. Warm, a good sign. He cleaned the bedding and the small area around Quito using disinfectant wipes and bottled water. He needed to eliminate as many foreign scents as possible, relying on the concrete and the closed environment to mask the cub's presence from any passing predators, or worse, park rangers. The thought of Quito's mother, desperate and hunting, was a constant, unsettling drumbeat in the back of his mind. Next came the feeding. Daniel repeated the careful process from the night before, warming the high-calorie liquid supplement and preparing the syringe. This time, Quito was more alert. As Daniel gently nudged the rubber tip against the cub's mouth, Quito's luminous gold eyes opened fully, fixed on Daniel. He didn't just suckle. He nursed with frantic, desperate energy, a clear indication that his appetite and strength were returning. The tiny, persistent sounds Quito made while feeding were profoundly moving, the pure sound of a life force reasserting itself against impossible odds. For the first time since the rescue, Daniel allowed himself a moment of pure observation, the photographer replacing the rescuer. He watched Quito's spotted fur, the disproportionately large paws, symbols of the powerful adult he was destined to become. The spots were beautiful, natural camouflage that would fade as he grew, but for now they made him look fragile, like a miniature leopard. After the feed, Quito spent a few minutes stretching his small, clumsy body, and then, inexplicably, he began to play. He batted at the edge of his blanket, stalked an imaginary foe on the concrete floor, and then, in a moment that truly stole Daniel's breath, he tried to pounce on Daniel's foot. It was a pathetic, wobbly attempt, but it was playful. It was life. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you, Quito?" Daniel murmured, scratching the soft fur behind the cub's ears. Quito responded with a low, rumbling sound, a baby purr that resonated deep in Daniel's chest. In that instant, the protective instinct transformed into something deeper, a powerful, almost paternal bond. Daniel was no longer just saving an animal, he was caring for Quito. The cub was relying on him completely, accepting him without question as the source of safety, warmth, and life. However, Quito's improved condition only amplified the next, immediate crisis: food. The emergency electrolyte solution and human supplement mixture were temporary fixes. Quito was growing, and he needed species-specific nutrition, a powdered milk formula designed for wild felines, high in protein, fat, and the essential nutrients crucial for a lion cub's rapid development. Daniel knew he was running out of time and resources. He retreated to the vehicle, meticulously checking his satellite communications equipment. The isolation that usually brought him peace was now a cage. He couldn't risk calling the nearest town or general supplier. He needed specialized materials, and he needed them delivered to a distant, safe rendezvous point, or he needed to drive out to a reliable veterinary supplier hundreds of miles away. He finally composed a cryptic, carefully worded message, avoiding names and specific locations, and transmitted it to his single most trusted contact in the region, Dr. Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a British veterinarian who ran a small, highly respected and deeply discreet wildlife rehabilitation center near the border. She specialized in rewilding big cats and was the only person Daniel trusted to understand his impossible situation. The waiting was agonizing. For hours, Daniel busied himself securing the station, checking for signs of wildlife, and continuously monitoring Quito. He found an old, sturdy wooden crate in the garage, which he cleaned thoroughly and adapted into a temporary, safe den for Quito, ensuring it was well ventilated but secure. He practiced the routine, anticipating the cub's growth, knowing that within weeks, Quito would transition from a helpless infant to a creature capable of scratching, biting, and eventually killing. The satellite phone finally chirped, the sound loud in the silent concrete box. It was a text message from Sarah. The message was concise, professional, and entirely focused on logistics. Understood. Preparing F-48. Need coordinates for drop zone tomorrow midday. Must be secure. High risk for both. Do not delay. F-48 was the commercial code for the specialized feline milk replacement. Relief washed over Daniel, so intense it made him physically weak. Sarah was in, but the message also underscored the gravity of their actions. High risk. This was now a covert operation, a desperate race against the clock and the watchful eyes of the conservation authorities who viewed unlicensed interference with apex predators as a serious offense. Daniel quickly transmitted a set of grid coordinates, a dry, remote watering hole 80 miles away, notorious for being deserted this time of year due to the mud. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Drive out, meet Sarah's delivery team, which he suspected would be just Sarah herself, accompanied by a single trusted driver, exchange supplies, and return, all within a few tense hours. He would have to leave Quito alone for the first extended period. He spent the rest of the day in intensive bonding and care with Quito, as if to compensate for the coming absence. He used his camera not to photograph, but to record short video clips of the cub's unique characteristics and growing strength, a visual log he knew would be essential for Sarah's assessment. He recorded the soft purring, the little squeaky roars, and the way Quito's small body instinctively pressed against Daniel's leg when he slept. The cub was thriving on the human touch and the consistent warmth. The emotional connection Daniel felt was undeniable, a powerful anchor in the swirling ethical storm. He realized he was falling deeply in love with this tiny scrap of the wild, and that love was the greatest danger of all. It made the eventual separation, the necessary release back into the wild, seem impossible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with the fiery colors that only Africa can produce, Daniel watched Quito sleep. He spoke aloud, outlining the cub's future, as if speaking it would make it real, make it right. "You are not mine, Quito. You are the savannah's. I am just a guardian, a temporary bridge back to your destiny. We have to be smart, and we have to be quick." The long evening was spent meticulously preparing the Wanderer for the next day's high-stakes supply run. He checked the winch, filled the spare fuel tanks, and packed emergency rations, constantly glancing at the small, warm presence in the den. He had to be quick and return before Quito's next feed was due. This covert trip was the first critical test of his commitment and operational security. Daniel sat down beside the crate, simply being present. Quito stirred, recognizing the familiar scent and sound of his rescuer, and let out a soft, tired groan. It was in this moment of quiet, intense intimacy that Daniel understood the true weight of the miracle he had found. A life saved by chance, now carried forward by intention. And before we dive headfirst into Daniel's treacherous undercover journey to secure the vital supplies Quito needs and discover the shocking secrets that Sarah Jenkins will reveal about the cub's future, we have a quick but important message. If Quito's amazing story of survival and the deep, challenging bond he shares with Daniel has touched your heart, please don't let this journey end here. Now is the perfect time to make sure you've subscribed to the channel, and if you're enjoying the drama and the hope, please smash that like button. Every subscription and every like helps us share these powerful stories of rescue and second chances with a worldwide audience. Your support makes every miracle possible. Now let's get back to the heart of the savannah, where Daniel is preparing for the riskiest move of his life. The rendezvous was set for the early afternoon, giving Daniel just enough time to drive through the recovering mud tracks. He needed a final check of Quito's health before leaving. He measured the cub's heartbeat and respiration, both strong, a testament to his resilient wild genetics. The fear was no longer of Quito dying, but of Quito becoming too attached. He needed to avoid any deep human imprinting, but the required frequent handling made that difficult. As Daniel secured the makeshift wooden crate door, giving Quito a final soft scratch behind the ears, the cub let out a powerful protesting sound. It wasn't a baby mule, it was a rough, resonant sound, closer to a real roar than a squeak. It was a declaration of strength and, more worryingly, of distress at the separation. Daniel felt a stab of guilt, knowing this distress could attract unwanted attention if any other animals were in the area. But he had to leave. He closed the heavy garage door behind him, securing the rusty chain as best he could, the silence of the empty station swallowing Quito's cries. Daniel climbed into the Wanderer, his heart heavy. As he pulled the vehicle out, he made a wide circle around the station, his binoculars scanning the horizon. Nothing. The plains were still empty, scarred by the storm, but now baking rapidly under the harsh returning sun. The journey was brutal. The mud, though drying, had turned into a thick, rutted paste that made the vehicle bounce and slide precariously. Daniel had to employ all his considerable driving skill, often reversing and taking long, sweeping detours to avoid deep traps. He knew every minute spent here increased the danger for Quito, left alone and vulnerable. After an hour of intense driving, Daniel's focus shifted sharply from the road to the airwaves. His satellite radio picked up a faint, choppy signal. It was a localized chatter from the Regional Park Patrol, standard operational checks, but something was amiss. The voices were strained, focused on a specific area, not far from the coordinates he had set for the rendezvous. Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The park rangers were discussing abnormal lion behavior, specifically a lone lioness displaying erratic, desperate movements, searching near the boundary of the protected area. A lone lioness, Quito's mother. She hadn't given up. The thought was both a relief and a profound threat. Relief that the pride hadn't abandoned her completely, threat because her frantic searching was drawing the attention of the very authorities Daniel was trying to avoid. If the rangers found the distressed lioness, they would intensify their investigation. If they found Quito, or worse, found Daniel with Quito, the consequences would be dire. Not just for Daniel's career, but for the cub's chance at a natural life. Daniel pushed the Wanderer harder, racing against the tightening net of the authorities and the desperate search of Quito's mother. He checked the map. The rendezvous point was now only 15 minutes away. He knew he had to be quick, get the supplies, and get back without being seen. His heart hammered not from the physical danger, but from the immense moral and ethical burden he was carrying. He was running a dangerous, illegal gauntlet of compassion, with the fragile life of a future king resting on his ability to remain unseen in the vast open savanna. The clock was ticking, the authorities were closing in, and somewhere out there, Quito's fiercely protective mother was drawing ever closer. Daniel knew that the exchange with Sarah would determine everything, but what she was about to tell him would shake his entire reality to its core, revealing a secret about Quito that made the rescue far more complicated than simple survival. Daniel drove the final stretch to the rendezvous point with his teeth clenched, listening intently to the faint crackling chatter on the radio. The Park Patrol frequency confirmed his worst fear. They were converging on the area, sweeping the perimeter near the protected boundary, searching for the distressed lioness. He knew he had minutes, not hours. The designated watering hole was a shallow, sun-baked depression, currently a mix of drying mud and cracked earth. As he approached, he spotted the vehicle, a heavily modified Land Cruiser, much smaller and less conspicuous than his own, painted in neutral, dusty colors. Standing beside it, shaded by the only meager tree, was Dr. Sarah Jenkins. She was a figure of quiet authority, dressed in practical bush attire, her face etched with the worry that came from dealing with the relentless challenges of conservation. With her was a single driver, a large man named Moses, who immediately moved to observe the surrounding plains with binoculars. Daniel pulled up alongside Sarah, cutting the engine instantly. The silence was immediate, broken only by the chirping of insects and the desperate rush of their breaths. There were no pleasantries, only urgency. "Daniel, you're late," Sarah stated, her voice low and tense, her blue eyes scanning the horizon. "The F-48 is ready, but we have company. They are 20 minutes away, maximum." "The Lioness is drawing them in," Daniel responded, already unlatching the supply boxes. "She hasn't given up. I need to know what you meant about the complications. Quito is stable, but he needs this formula now. The situation at the station is unsustainable." Sarah gestured for Daniel to follow her, moving away from Moses and the driver. Her expression was grave, signaling the seriousness of the revelation. She stopped beneath the shade, her gaze fixed on Daniel. "I didn't just check on your request, Daniel. I checked on the Pride. The Pride Quito was separated from. They are the pride of the borderlands, and they are unique. Quito is not just any lion cub, Daniel." Daniel felt a sudden chill, despite the searing heat. "What are you saying?" "Quito is the direct descendant of a critically rare genetic line. A line that carries the recessive white gene, but with a highly unusual melanistic characteristic in his paw pads and the tips of his ears. This lineage is incredibly valuable to the global gene pool and has been secretly monitored by a small private consortium, not the park authorities, for years. That lone lioness searching so frantically, that's not just a mother. She's the dominant female of a protected, unregistered breeding program." Sarah lowered her voice further, making sure only Daniel could hear. "This means two things. First, if the park authorities find him, they won't just fine you, they will confiscate him permanently, and he will become a commodity for breeding, likely never seeing the wild again. Second, his mother is exhibiting behavior that suggests she knows he's still alive and is dangerously close to the location where you found him. She's not resting. She's a massive, highly identifiable threat right now, and she's getting closer to human settlements." The news hit Daniel like a physical blow. He hadn't just rescued a lost cub. He had stumbled upon a national treasure, a piece of living, irreplaceable heritage, and his actions now held immense geopolitical and conservation weight. The stakes had been raised exponentially. "So what's the plan?" Daniel asked, the fear replaced by a sharp, focused determination. "I can't leave him at the station, and I can't drive him hundreds of miles back to your center alone." "You won't be alone," Sarah confirmed, already moving toward her vehicle. "My facility is the only place with the secure, long-term facilities for rewilding a cub of this value. You need to return to the station immediately, load Quito, and drive him directly to the coordinates I am giving you now. They are 75 miles north of my main center, a safe house. I will follow discreetly. Moses will stay here to monitor the rangers and ensure they don't follow your tracks. We must be surgical, Daniel. One mistake, one sighting, and we lose him forever." They worked with silent, desperate speed. Sarah handed Daniel a large, temperature-controlled box containing the F-48 formula, a feeding kit, antibiotics, and a small, high-tech tracking collar designed for cubs. She then quickly reviewed the rigorous feeding, stimulation, and bonding schedule. "Minimize human contact, but maximize his comfort," she instructed. "He needs to recognize your scent as safety, but he must never associate humanity with dependence beyond this infancy phase." Daniel accepted the responsibilities, his hands shaking slightly as he secured the precious cargo. He transmitted the new coordinates to his own GPS, a route that cut across the most desolate, rarely patrolled stretches of the savannah, a dangerous choice, but the only fast way through. As Daniel prepared to leave, Sarah put a hand on his arm, her expression softening momentarily. "Daniel, what you did was brave, reckless, and magnificent. You saved him. Now, let's save his future." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and climbed back into the Wanderer. He gave a sharp wave to Moses, who was already disappearing into the distant heat haze, his vigilance a silent promise of cover. Daniel executed a rapid, precise U-turn, heading back along the treacherous tracks. The sun was now directly overhead, its heat beating down, promising a hellish drive. The return trip was faster, spurred by adrenaline and the sheer necessity of rescuing Quito. Daniel arrived back at the ranger station in a cloud of dust, slamming the brakes. The anxiety surged when he heard the faint, high-pitched cry from inside the garage. Quito was awake and distressed by the separation. Daniel grabbed the carrier crate and the medical bag and ran. Inside, Quito was pacing frantically in his small wooden den, protesting the isolation with a series of loud, rough meows. The noise level was alarming, high enough to carry on the wind. Daniel wasted no time, soothing the cub with soft words while preparing the new carrier. He transferred Quito into the specialized transport box, lined with soft padding and ventilation holes, placing a familiar-smelling piece of his old blanket inside for comfort. Quito quieted instantly, recognizing Daniel's presence and scent. Daniel secured Quito in the back of the Wanderer, now the vehicle of a fugitive. He glanced at the tracking device Sarah had given him. He needed to activate it, but only after they were well away from the station. He pulled out, reversing slowly, making sure his tire tracks covered his previous distinct approach lines as much as possible. A small, futile effort at concealment. They drove for an hour, pushing the limits of the vehicle, skirting around the edges of thick bush and avoiding any main tracks. Daniel finally stopped in a dense copse of trees, far from any established route. He activated the small GPS tracking collar, securing it gently around Quito's neck. It was a visible sign of the complex technological intervention now required to protect this wildlife. As they began the longest leg of the journey, heading towards the remote safe house, the unthinkable happened. The Wanderer topped a small rise, and Daniel immediately slammed on the brakes, throwing up a curtain of dust. Less than 100 yards ahead, standing dead center in the middle of the track, was the lone lioness, Quito's mother. She was magnificent and terrifying, her massive body gaunt from the search, her coat dark and wet in patches, her eyes fixed on the Wanderer with an intense, burning concentration. She was not aggressive, but desperate. Daniel realized she must have picked up the faintest echo of Quito's scent trail from the mud that clung to his vehicle and followed it with the relentless logic of a mother's instinct. The cub's brief cries at the station had been enough to guide her here. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The lioness lowered her head, sniffing the ground, then raised it, focusing her attention directly on the back of Daniel's vehicle, where Quito was secured. Daniel held his breath, every instinct screaming at him to reverse, but he knew any sudden movement would trigger an attack. The lioness was too close, too desperate. Then, Quito began to whine, a soft, uncertain sound from the back of the car, responding to the proximity of his mother's scent, a scent he hadn't realized he had missed until this moment. It was a tiny, fragile call, but the lioness heard it. Her ears twitched. She took one hesitant, measured step forward. Daniel watched, paralyzed, knowing that if she attacked the vehicle, Quito would be caught in the inevitable violent defense. This was the raw, brutal climax of the wild, and Daniel was caught between the love of a mother and the necessity of rescue. He spoke, his voice low and calm, even though his heart was a frantic drum. "I'm sorry, girl. I'm just trying to save him." The lioness stopped. She looked at Daniel, then back at the vehicle. There was a pause that stretched into an eternity, a standoff between man and beast, protection versus interference. Then, in a moment of profound, inexplicable understanding, or perhaps just exhaustion, she let out a low, mournful sigh that was the deepest sound Daniel had ever heard. It was a sound of loss, of recognition, and of surrender to an overwhelming force. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her massive head, took one last, long look, and then padded silently off the track, disappearing into the tall, golden grass. The tension broke, leaving Daniel shaking violently. He waited 5 minutes, his gaze fixed on the spot where she vanished, before slowly, carefully moving the vehicle forward. It was a narrow escape, a moment that Daniel would revisit in his dreams for the rest of his life. A silent, powerful exchange of custodianship. The remaining journey to the safe house was uneventful but tense. Daniel finally arrived at a small, heavily fortified and hidden compound surrounded by a high electric fence, an island of human intervention in the wild. Sarah was there, waiting, her face pale when Daniel described the encounter with the lioness. Quito was immediately brought into the clean, sterile environment. Sarah, Moses, and Daniel worked through the night, stabilizing the cub, monitoring his vitals, and finally feeding him the correct, specialized formula. Quito thrived instantly, growing stronger and more vocal. Days turned into weeks. Quito remained at the safe house, under the joint care of Daniel and Sarah. They implemented a rigorous anti-imprinting protocol, using specialized protective clothing and masks during feeding, and using recordings of lioness calls for comfort, not human voices. Daniel knew his time with Quito was limited. The initial, intense bond had to give way to the necessary detachment required for rewilding. Sarah established the long-term plan, 6 months of intensive, non-human imprinted care, followed by placement with a surrogate lioness in a massive, secured habitat. And then the final terrifying leap, release back into the wild, far from the borderlands, ensuring his rare genetics could still contribute without falling into the hands of illegal breeders or compromising the protected pride. On the day of Quito's transfer to the large habitat, Daniel stood on the viewing deck, watching the small, muscular cub exploring the grass and trees of his new, safer world. He was no longer a whimpering, wet bundle of fear. He was a lion, growing into his destiny. He looked up at Daniel once, a moment of recognition in his golden eyes, and then turned back to the wild, embracing his natural inheritance. Daniel turned away, the silence in the cab of the wanderer now echoing with absence. The journey had ended, the rescue complete, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. He had found a king in the storm, protected him, and returned him to his throne. It was the hardest, most necessary goodbye he would ever face. A silent act of love that defined his life's commitment to the wild. Quito was saved, and now he was finally home, exactly where he belonged.